Well, you understand this goes back now to December of 2010, and a gentleman from Russia named Leonid Elenin, who was a mathematician working at the institute in Moscow. I forget the exact name, but everyone can Google. Google is your friend. Apparently, this guy has been an amateur astronomer for many, many years, and 2 or 3 years, I guess. And you now have the capability, if you have resources, meaning money, you can hire a telescope for a night. You can actually rent time on significant facilities all over the world, and via the internet, you can remote control the telescope with a computer. You can direct it to certain parts of the sky. You can take images. You can then download them. You can, process them on your own computer with not having to be there. You can be literally thousands of miles away, and the staff at the facility will make sure the telescope doesn't break down, and the computer, connections are valid, and the internet service stays up. But you can do remote control observations anywhere in the world now, and that's what Leonid Elenin did on the evening of December 10th when he took 4 CCD images, digital images, of a section of the sky in Leo, which is our first curious little coincidence, and he discovered this tiny little fuzzy dot, so dim it was millions of times dimmer than you could see with the naked eye, and he called it Comet Elenin. Well, the first thing that got my attention, other than the fact that his first name is Leo, and that this is photographed in the constellation of Leo, which right there is an important symbolism, is that the magnitude, meaning the brightness, according to the international standards, of the comet when he first detected it and published the news on December 10th of 2009, was 19.5. That, of course, for the audience who's been following our work, is a very significant number. Now, the other thing that you need to think about is that December 10th turns out to have been the 2-year anniversary to the night of the Norway spiral appearing over northern Norway and Finland and Sweden just before our President Barack Obama, arrived in Oslo to pick up his Nobel Prize for Peace. That's where one begins to track the dots as a much larger matrix of something important going on.
Absolutely, and of course we have to talk a little bit about 9/11 as well here, Richard. I don't know if it's the 10th. I've heard different dates on this. The 10th of September or possibly the 11th of September that Elenin is going to be closest to the sun, I believe. Significance of that?
Well, after I started looking at the fact that this was very strange, I mean, right after Elenin posted these images, there began this very bizarre drumbeat all over the internet, what I call fear porn. There must be 1,000 YouTube videos now claiming that Elenin is going to inaugurate or create the end of the world, that it's really Nibiru,
right,
that it's a brown dwarf, it's going to destroy the solar system, it's going to smash into the Earth, it has a huge tail of rocks and other debris that pulling in its wake, and we cross the trajectory after it passes the sun, and we're going to be destroyed that way. There is every conceivable nonsense out there, all focused on this absolutely insignificant little speck in the dark that under any normal circumstances no one would even notice. I mean, to Elenin himself, it's a kind of a big deal, because the way the convention goes, if you discover a comet, you get to name it after you. So there's ego involved. But to anybody else, I mean, something that when you discover it somewhere between Jupiter and Mars, which is as far out as it was when he picked it up, and the fact that it's only 19.5 magnitude, they're now forecasting, based on models of conventional comets, that this object won't even reach naked eye brightness as it goes around the sun, as it comes closest to the sun, which is in September, and I'll get to that in a minute. Under any normal circumstance, Heinrich, this would be totally inconsequential. No one should be paying attention. There are something like 100 of these objects that come through the inner solar system every year. So we're dealing down at the 1% level. What makes Elenin so extraordinarily weird and interesting, and the object is so much directed and generated and deliberate fear? This is where I really got curious, so I started looking on the NASA websites. There's one at JPL, and there's others around the world, at what they call the orbital elements, the ephemeris, which is the basic orbit determination based on observations of where this thing is going to be in space at any individual minute. They now know the orbit down to about half a minute, plus or minus. Mm. And one of the first things I discovered is that it will be closest to the Earth on September 11th. Now, there are debunkers out there, skeptics, paid trolls, who are spreading lies that this thing has nothing to do with September 11th. That's because they don't want people to know or notice that this thing is closest to the Earth on September 11th. Now, what do I mean by that? It's not closest on September 11th on the east coast of the United States. It's not closest to the Earth on September 11th, Greenwich Mean Time. It's closest to the Earth when it's September 11th in the far east. And the question then is, why is that relevant? Because when our classic, what we now know as September 11th occurred, the destruction of the two World Trade Center towers and the attack on the Pentagon on September 11th of 2009, the year 2000, it was an event which overtook the entire world. It was 2001. It did not leave unaffected anybody on this planet. We have undergone a social revolution worldwide because of the events that were sparked by 9/11 in New York. Would you agree with that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Which means if there's any part of the Earth which is involved in this comet, i.e. in terms of its closest approach, then in fact the symbolism is signifying that epic day where the world changed. You can't go through any airport on this planet now without experiencing the effects of 9/11 in the United States. You can't board a train or get on a ship or even go into a major public government building without experiencing the effects psychologically, politically, or emotionally of what happened on 9/11 in the United States. So for the skeptics, the critics, the naysayers, to say, oh, no, this is really going by the Earth on the 10th, no, they're missing the point. This is a global phenomenon, and it is passing the sun at the closest point where one part of the planet is literally on 9/11. The next data point, which made me think this was really unusual, is its closest approach to the Earth, which is on October 16th. Now, there's nothing that one can see in the record that would make October 16th stand out. However, on October 16th at 19 hours 50 minutes, give or take half a minute, the comet is close to the Earth, Greenwich Mean Time. And 19 hours 50 minutes, of course, is 19.5. Now, how do you get a little tiny object which is absolutely insignificant? It doesn't mean anything in the cosmic order of things. How do you get it timed so it literally is closest to the planet at 19.5 Greenwich Mean Time, which is the world standard of time? Then you have to look at the orbital inclination. The inclination of the orbit, meaning the tilt of the plane of the orbit, because all orbits are planes. They have to go around the sun, where basically they have to go around the sun with the axis of the orbit through the center of the sun, which is the dominant gravitational field that causes them to orbit the sun. The inclination of that orbit is marked off in degrees. Like for Pluto, which is the outermost planet, used to be a planet, now it's technically called a dwarf planet, it orbits at an inclination to the Earth's orbit of something like 17.5 degrees. The orbit of Elenin around the sun to the Earth's orbit is 1.8439, and you keep following the decimal points out. You divide that number into 360, which is the number of degrees in a total full circle, you get 19.5. 195. So there are redundancies. There are hyperdimensional tetrahedral redundancies, and I haven't even gone into the other elements on the website where these numbers repeat and repeat and repeat, to where it's overwhelming now in our analysis that somehow, for some reason, in some way, this little tiny object found by Leonid Elenin on the 10th of December of 2010 is in fact a directed, an intelligently directed object which appears to be a comet, but in fact, in this analysis, must be something far more significant. Otherwise, A, why all the tetrahedral components to its orbit, and B, why all the fear porn being spread to get people to be terrified of its coming as opposed to anticipating with openness and expectation that it's coming. To me, this is a directed event, and we are not supposed to welcome it. We're supposed to fear it. And then the question is, who is it who is trying to put cultural fear in our mind about an object that most people on the earth, literally billions of people, would never even knew existed unless it were for this directed campaign of overwhelming fear.
How do you think it would be different if we instead had an approach of welcoming it instead of fearing it, Richard?
Well, now you have to get a little bit further out in the model, which is, our model is that the hyperdimensional physics of this planet is changing. The reason that 9/11 took place, when it took place, it was a key moment in the change of physics where an imprint, a terrible, overwhelming cloud of fear and despondency and emotional terror could be infused on the general consciousness of people on planet Earth. That, to me, if you go back and you look at the celestial configurations for the day of 9/11, particularly in New York, that signature absolutely jumps out at you. This event, 9/11, 10 years ago, was meant to change the course of human consciousness in a negative direction using the tools of the physics that we have been investigating. By the same token, on the anniversary of that event, which is another moment in the force where you can seize control of people's consciousness, if you do it correctly, meaning you do it wrongly, you imprint the wrong message, the wrong field, the wrong matrix on that moment, you can then again give that fear a booster shot, which in the largest model, if we're dealing with some kind of war for human consciousness, a war for where people's perceptions will place human society in an evolutionary chain where we can take one of two roads, a high road or a low road. Someone is warring for our very being, our very view of how reality unfolds. And you do this in the physics by intervening at certain moments where the celestial configurations of the planets and our alignment with the galaxy, etc., are in this crucial configuration where what you do will have very important and stunning, last-longing effects in the realm of consciousness itself. Elenin appears to be something which is either supposed to bring us to a new level of consciousness, in other words, to get us to think bigger, more expansive, more positive thoughts for the unfoldment of history at this critical moment in time, or it looks like the bad guys are trying to imprint their view on Elenin and its coming around the sun at this particular time to imprint another 9/11 scenario, another pall of doom and gloom and horror and travesty and angst on that same consciousness. In other words, it looks to me like someone has escalated this war, which we've been involved in at least for 10 years, and now the stakes are literally our very consciousness itself.
There's a Bosnian scientist, Richard, behind the idea of, he calls it the georesonator concept, and I don't know if I pronounce his name correctly, Mensur Omerbashik or something like that, I think a Bosnian scientist, and he put out this paper about astronomical alignments, with Elenin as the cause of earthquakes and things like that. That's given quite a bit of fuel, I guess, to this many of these speculations as well. And interesting enough, obviously, some of them are spot on. It's just the way it is, right?
Well, the problem with that model is you're assuming that no one is putting their thumb on the scales. You're assuming no one is trying to manipulate this consciousness. You can equally validly say that his paper, which is interesting, is also part of the disinformation going on around this event. I mean, who is this guy? Was there ever anybody except Enterprise, ourselves, who has looked at planetary alignments and denoted certain physical effects from the alignments of planets with each other and with the Earth? If you go back through the literature, if you go back and search the LNR website or you search any other databases, there are none. This is the first paper that has appeared specifically trying to connect disasters on the Earth with planetary alignments with the Earth, particularly now with this object, Elenin. Let me give you another model. We've been talking about a breakaway civilization. I'm going to be in Leeds, north of London, in a couple weeks, with Richard Dolan and some other conferees discussing the so-called secret space program at the Exopolitics conference in up there in Leeds. It is our model that we have been dealing for at least the last 60 years, post-World War II, with a significant breakaway, Nazi-based post-World War II civilization, which has basically set up shop in outer space, either on the moon or in some kind of a satellite that you can't see because it's too small with current terrestrial technology to detect, and that we are confronting, certainly in the last 10 years, this breakaway civilization which has given us an ultimatum and in fact was responsible for the events of 9/11 in New York and at the Pentagon, using directed energy technology, torsion field weapons technology, using the same physics we've been discussing as the weapon, to create terrestrial disasters around the planet, generated earthquakes, manipulated weather, other types of manufactured events where thousands of birds or thousands of fish or millions of other forms of wildlife are struck down suddenly overnight as a means of leveraging the governments of this planet to cancel their expansion plans into the solar system, i.e. like going back to the moon with President Bush, and basically telling us to stay confined to planet Earth. You'll notice that when President Obama came into office, one of the first things that was done, which was basically very peculiar to a lot of people, was he was awarded in December of 2009 the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
And he traveled to Norway, to Oslo, to pick it up. Well, the night before he picked up his prize, in the skies over northern Norway, this amazing phenomena appeared, which became known as the Norway Spiral. And if you go to our enterprisemission.com website, you'll see a very elaborate, very in-depth three-part analysis of the Norway Spiral and the physical effects that were required to create it and what was done in terms of the symbolism around it to send a message to Obama, which was to, as our interpretation goes, cease and desist what he was planning to do to warrant his being awarded the Nobel Prize. Well, now you fast forward the film to the 42nd anniversary, which occurred just this week, of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, and the fact that there are certain things occurring in NASA, which we're going to get to in a few minutes, which are clearly connected with disclosure of the real solar system that we inhabit, which includes Elenin, and you find another extraordinary event happening this time directly in Oslo, Norway, which is this mysterious bombing, which occurred one day after a bizarre earthquake occurred, which had exactly the same torsion field signature of these other earthquakes that have occurred around the planet, which this paper attributes to Elenin, and in fact we attribute to the secret space war, which is timed to coincide with Elenin to politically, again, get people to fear whatever it represents that is coming. We are engaged in a multi-leveled war in our analysis, not only at the physical level, but basically for our hearts and minds and souls, and someone is pulling out all stops to get people on this planet to be afraid, to be very, very afraid of what is coming. It is a classic technique, and this time I don't think it's going to work.
So technology is being used, you're saying, to coincide when these alignment points happen for us to believe that this is a natural event.
Because the object itself, Elenin itself, has not enough mass or spin to create anything of this nature, of this kind.
Right. Well, that's why some people obviously said NASA's lying. It's really a big brown dwarf or whatever.
Well, but you see, you can easily dismiss that, because what you do is you take a telescope outside and you point it at any planet, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, Mars, the Moon, and you crank in the coordinates of that planet or that object for that time, and then you look through the eyepiece of your telescope. Most modern telescopes that are now sold, Heinrich, come with what's called computer-assisted go-to controls, meaning go to this object, go to that object, for people who basically know nothing about astronomy.
Right, yeah.
Amateur astronomy has now become almost an online plug-in for people who know nothing about astronomy, that just want to, look at things through their telescope without having to know how you find things.
Yep.
All those computerized controls are built on planetary models of where the objects will be as they orbit the sun, right?
Right.
If I make a date with you to meet you at the local railway station to take a train somewhere at a certain time, and they've changed the timetable so the train doesn't arrive on time when you and I are supposed to be there, we're not going to get our train, right?
That's right.
The planets are like trains. They run on timetables. They run on what are called ephemerides, which can be calculated for literally thousands of years forward and back. That's how good the planetary models are now. If an object like Nibiru, or a dwarf star, or a brown dwarf, were to come into the solar system and be as close to us now as Elenin, every one of the orbits of every single object in the solar system would be so gravitationally disturbed that no amateur could take his telescope outside in his backyard and plug in the computer coordinates and have it go to anything that he could see. And there would be an incredible furor all over the internet of all kinds of people claiming, where are my planets? I can't find my planets. Nothing like that is going on. So the whole Elenin Nibiru dwarf star thing is a deliberate fear porn hoax.
So can we talk a little bit about who is behind Elenin then, and why this was, I guess, chosen as the object? Is it just a symbol, or is it that the timing of this is
I think, no.
Yeah.
According again, and the only data we have are the numerical coordinates of the object itself, its orbit, and its trajectory. All right? Now, there's a very interesting dichotomy which has come out of the people trying to study this object. In planetary science, which of course extends to comets and asteroids and anything else that's out there, using Newton's laws, because things are moving so relatively slowly, you don't need to go to something as esoteric as Einstein relativity. You can use Newton. And Newton, as I said, is what's running all these telescope programs, so that you can literally, if people lived 1,000 years, they could take their telescope outside and they could spot Jupiter 1,000 years from now using the same go-to coordinates that's in their telescope for tonight. These are based on Newton's laws of celestial mechanics. Action, reaction, F equals ma, et cetera, and what are called Kepler's laws. Well, if you apply these laws to Elenin, you get an orbit. And it is a standard rule of practice that all you need are 3 observations of an orbiting object to define that orbit. Now, it's better if these observations are very far apart. In other words, for an orbit that's thousands of years long, you'd preferably like them, maybe 100 days apart. But for an orbit of an object like a planet orbiting the sun, if you go outside and you observe a planet for 3 nights running, you can derive, with your equations, if you're the right kind of mathematician that can do this stuff, you can derive a very accurate orbit with only 3 nights of data for Mars or Jupiter or Venus or Mercury, etc. We now have almost a year's worth of data on Elenin. It's actually 200 plus days. There are something like 3,000, not 3, but 3,000 astronomical observations of Elenin from all over the world, from amateurs like Leonid Elenin in Sri Lanka, in Brussels, in England, in the United States, in France, in Spain, in Australia. All over the world, observations have been made by amateurs. These CCD camera imaging, and they are sent to a central database at Harvard called the Small Planets Center. And those guys do the actual computer modeling, which derives an orbit for Elenin, or any other object for that matter, based on these observations flowing in from all over the world. So this is not an official set of people like NASA saying this is the orbit. These are orbits derived from people's observations that is so democratic you could not imagine a more democratic scientific process. And the orbit, if it wasn't again accurate, when amateurs went out the next night to photograph Elenin, it wouldn't be in their telescope's visibility. It would be moved. It would be changed. So this is a number that we know extraordinarily well even this early in the game. And we've known it now for months and months and months, the orbit of Elenin. However, there are 2 official orbits that are on the websites all over the world. The NASA website, if you go to the JPL site, and I don't have the link, but you can Google Elenin JPL ephemeris, and it will bring you to the JPL page. It says the orbit of this object is hyperbolic. Now, what does that mean? That is a very special, in fact, it is a unique astronomical designation. A hyperbolic object is an object which is not gravitationally bound to the sun. It means it's come from interstellar space, from the galaxy. It's coming through the solar system one time, which is now. It's then making a hairpin turn around the sun because of the sun's gravity. It's going back out into interstellar space, and it will never be here again. Now, in the entire history of astronomy, Heinrich, there has never been a hyperbolic object ever recorded or tracked or photographed.
That's right. That's why it's caught them out of the blue in one way, right?
Let me repeat. Yeah, exactly. This is a unique object. It's a one in a lifetime, actually in the history of astronomy's lifetime, which goes back, visually with human beings looking with their naked eye to the Chinese, thousands of years. What are the odds that an object which is an interstellar visitor for the first and last time is going to have orbital parameters which in fact make it a tetrahedral hyperdimensional object by the numbers? Its inclination, its passage time around the sun, the closest point to passing by the Earth. In other words, that's impossible. The odds are millions, if not billions and billions to one that this is accidental. That right there should show you this is a directed object by some kind of intelligent design. Someone has sent this to us. It's not a random event. So the next data point is that Elenin himself, remember our mathematician, the amateur astronomer outside Moscow at the Institute, he has calculated a totally different orbit for his own comet, Elenin. He says the orbit is bound, meaning this is an object which has come around the sun before, is going to come around again, and he has pegged its orbit as roughly 13,000 years. Well, that's a huge divergence. I mean, JPL, which is acquiring all these observations of all these amateurs all over the world and has been modeling this orbit for months and months and months, is saying, again, still on their website, this is a hyperbolic object. And Elenin on his website, which again you can find by Googling, and it's also on Facebook. There are two pages on Facebook, one Elenin's personal page and the other his space observations page. He is clearly saying this object is now a 13,000-year period. Well, that's an incredible discrepancy between two groups, two institutions working on, and this is crucial, the same database. The same data.
How
can this be?
Yeah, how can this be?
Obviously, there's a political war going on. There's a political food fight behind the scenes. One group wants you to keep thinking this has never happened before and will never happen again, and the other group wants you to understand this is a periodic object which was here 13,000 years ago and is now coming back 13,000 years later. Well, why is that important?
Yeah, well, exactly 13,000 years. The people who are into these kinds of topics, Richard, understands that a whole lot of things are hinging on the 13,000 year date, if you will, this cycle, right, of recurring cataclysm, if you will.
Well, the 13,000 years is half the Earth's precessional cycle. It is half the epic period of the Mayan calendar. It is half, as you just said, the period in some mythologies where the Earth underwent a tremendous cataclysm and most of civilization and culture was destroyed, something we would call the Atlantean period, Atlantis. And the idea that an object is coming back to us from that time and NASA does not want us to connect the dots raises, in my mind, the idea, is this object somehow connected to the whole Atlantis mythology? Now, again, you could leap to the idea that it is some kind of destroying object, that it creates catastrophe. But if you don't go there, there's another model. Is it perhaps a harbinger of our salvation? Is it possible that Elenin is a space-traveling time capsule sent by our own ancestors 13,000 years ago with information and science and technology and a knowledge base, an archive, a library, which if we can decode what it is telling us will help us to avert this kind of natural cyclic cataclysm which hit human civilization the last time around, but now we've known enough to send our descendants a message for how to avert it this time. Is Elenin, in fact, a time capsule from our own ancestors with a salvation for our very future? And does someone not want us to know and pay attention to that message?
Well, we need to talk more about that aspect, Richard. Now, I want to ask you if there's even more than to why you've come to this conclusion, I guess, in that sense. But I want to run some other things by you here as well, because you brought up Atlantis, obviously. NASA's Atlantis makes its last mission July 21st. The sun enters Leo. You mentioned this about Leonid before, of course, and in December and all this. So the sun enters Leo on the Friday into the Saturday, when we have this thing happening in Oslo and on this island, Utøya. And we have a kind of, at this point, I guess, much is to be revealed about this and what actually is behind it and the motives. But in any regard, it doesn't really matter what we've been told so far, if you know what I mean, Richard, by the media. What they are putting out for us to believe is that we have some kind of Masonic Knights Templar of sorts person, Anders Behring Breivik, from Norway, doing this atrocities in Oslo and then consequently also on this island as well. What's in the numbers here? What are these events connected then in some way, do you think?
I think you have hit exactly the nail on the head, as we say over here. These are connected symbolically, deliberately, specifically, and again, because the message of Elenin is going to be provided to us at the appropriate time, which is later this fall, decoded and laid out in the world media for human beings to pay attention to, I now believe that Oslo, the latest atrocity, the horrors of Oslo, with as much horror as someone could create in a short period of time, is specifically designed to imprint a negative and fear-porn image over Masonry, over Freemasons, because the real guys, the real Freemasons, the ones who created the United States of America 200 plus years ago to be the shepherd through this time of peril, a la the 13,000-year cycle in our model, they're the ones who will be blamed for Oslo, and so any future message from this group will be viewed as terrorists as opposed to the saviors of mankind. It seems a very clear plot to destroy the messenger of what is coming.
It reminds me of Roberto Calvi when he was hanging under the Blackfriars Bridge in London. It was like someone was really keen to get people's attentions to start eyeing the Masons as being behind this.
Precisely. Now remember, there are real Masons and fake Masons. Masonry underwent a radical internal civil war and revolution. And so the Southern Rite, the Southern District Masons that we talk about these days, the ones with the 33 degrees and all that,
the Scottish Rite,
they're not the real guys. They're the fake, they're the pretenders, they're the usurpers who came in the last couple hundred years and attempted to steer Masonry in a different direction from its true esoteric and ancient history roots.
Mm-hmm. Oh, are you talking about
real Masons?
Are you talking about the Scottish Rite?
Exactly, exactly.
Right. Okay.
The real Masons, the ones we are supposed to pay attention to when the right time comes, the ones who have preserved this ancient information, which derives from, for instance, on Earth, we have a huge time capsule in this model. It's called the Great Pyramid. Who are the Masons who decoded and laid out the history of the Great Pyramid with the numbers, the cycles, the measurements, the Earth commensurabilities, the hyperdimensional physics codes, which are encoded in the Great Pyramid as only one of a few surviving time capsules that were built, again, in this model to help us survive the Earth changes that are coming unless we positively intervene. Mm-hmm. It now stands to reason if there's a group of people that basically want 6.5 billion human beings to destroy themselves, to not take the proper steps, to do what needs to be done to avert what is coming in terms of the planetary physics itself, they will try to destroy the messenger. The messengers on Earth, which are the Freemasons, the real ones, and the messenger in space, which is Elenin. And the key here is the linkage to the constellation Leo, which represents in ancient Egyptian tradition Horus, Horus of the horizon, Horus of the dawn.
I get the distinction here then, obviously, Richard, that you're making maybe more beyond just the Scottish Rite is obviously what you're talking about is the speculative Masonry versus the operative Masonry, correct?
You got it.
Yeah.
You got it.
So somebody has had the knowledge, right, in terms of building these things, incorporating some of the symbolism into this. And I guess what you're saying, Richard, is that at some point as well we've had a hijacking of that organization, the speculative branch.
You're reading me perfectly. That's exactly what I'm saying. The real guys were hijacked. A fake set of stuff has been put out for hundreds of years. So when the real, you know what hits the rotating appliance, no one is going to pay attention. It's, again, kill the messenger. And this wacko in Norway, in his Masonic regalia with all his diatribes on YouTube, et cetera, is a desperate last-minute effort in this model using the deaths of 94 people and a huge event in Norway itself to direct people off the message and the messenger, so instead of anticipating and listening carefully, they will be in fear and they will ignore the message.
Yeah, that's right. And, people, when you take a look at those images out there as well with the Masonic regalia, to me anyway at this stage, it looks very strange. It looks like his face has been photoshopped into those images. Also pay attention to the white background. It's a
stage play. It's designed to get people off the signal and simply pay attention to the noise. Now, the key thing about Horus, of course, is that the institution which is thousands. If I'm right, it's 13,000 years old. The Egyptians themselves talked about a group, a consecrated, sacred group, whose job it was to restore the first time. And if you know anything about Egyptian mythology, you know that that referred to the time before the catastrophe, when life worked properly, when people paid attention to Ma'at, which was truth, evenness, justice, order. I mean, look at the Earth today. We're certainly on this planet not living in Ma'at, right?
That's right.
Because the physics is broken, and the agency or the people or the institution in the Egyptian mythology, which is consecrated to restoring the appropriate and just attributes of a functioning humane society, are called the followers of Horus. Horus is Leo. We're talking about the originators of the Masonic order, who are, in our model, the followers of Horus. That's why this symbolism that went down in Oslo just a couple of days ago on the 22nd of July, pinioned around the moon landing, which of course was undertaken in service to these higher aspirations. That's why Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon on the 20th of July. It's all part of the same tapestry, part of the same symbolic order. It's why someone now is desperately trying to derail it with a 9/11 event. It totally out of place in the calendar, but because by the time we get to 9/11, the message of the followers of Horus will be out there in the major media, and someone is desperately trying to distract and to poison that message before it can be born.
One thing that I'm struggling with here, obviously, is how Oslo or Norway is actually part of this bigger picture then. Why is this happening over or in Norway, Richard?
Isn't that interesting? That, I think, means you have to go back and you have to look at the lineal descendants of Nordic people. I'm Swedish. I'm almost 100% Swedish. Swedes and Danes and Norwegians, we all share a common genetic heritage. You need to probe into the genetic heritage, and of course Oslo is very simple. Oslo is the Nobel Peace Prize. Oslo is the Norway center of the Nobel Prize, which is on Earth the award for the highest aspirations of mankind, is it not?
Well,
and it was just awarded
maybe it was at one point, but let's leave that to the side right now.
But you're talking a cultural institution. Remember, you don't attack individuals, you attack institutions. You try to debase the message of institutions. So if Oslo is the center of the Nobel Laureate Committee, there isn't science, there isn't medicine, there isn't physics, there isn't anything done on Earth which is not calibrated by who gets the Nobel Prize, right?
Okay, Stockholm was attacked December, was it 10th, by this bomber as well?
Well, again, that would fit in the model that we're looking at an attack on Nordic genotypes and the origin of who we, because I'll put myself in that category temporarily here, really are. And the fact that maybe we're not exactly all from the same place.
Okay, interesting.
Well, think about where white guys appear from. In our model, they come to us from Mars. The day before Elenin gets closest to the Earth, the day before it arrives at that closest point at 19.5, according to the Greenwich, clock system for the planet, Elenin literally crosses the face, the disk of Mars, as seen from Earth.
Okay, Richard, let me just make this connection here as well then, because the comet was discovered December 10th, as you mentioned, 2010, and then one day after that we have the kind of, if you will, then thwarted bombing attacks in Stockholm, right? Which is really, that's also where the main Nobel committee is sitting.
You've got it. You've got it. You've got the connections. Now let me give you one other data point. In the model of this object, Elenin, is a time capsule with information that is supposed to convey to humanity. at the critical time to allow us this time to avert the catastrophe? Because all you have to do is use the HD physics in the proper way, and the planetary crisis goes away. We have the tools. They've been developed over the last 60 years by the Black Ops guys. Nothing needs to be invented. All it has to do is to be applied to keeping radical Earth changes from happening, to keep the Earth from tipping over, to keep a pole shift from happening, to keep major earthquakes from taking place at critical points which will destroy millions, if not billions. Again, triggered by natural cosmic hyperdimensional events which are occasioned by the improper alignment of the Earth with the center of the galaxy and the planets and the rest of the solar system, which in the model is broken because of this great cosmic war that took place millions of years ago that destroyed an entire planet in the solar system, which has been called alternately Marduk, Marduk, and which, of course, is now where the asteroid belt lives. And NASA is visiting one of the key asteroids, the second largest asteroid in the belt right now, even as we speak, the asteroid called Vesta, is it not, with a mission called the Dawn Mission. This is not unconnected as well, as we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. So let's go back to December 10th, 2010. My dear departed friend Arthur C. Clarke, who I now firmly believe was a member in good standing of this secret order, the followers of Horus, along with several other huge lionized, if I can use that term, science fiction writers, who under the guise of their science fiction have been trying to tell us the truth of our own past for decade after decade after decade in this model. Arthur Clarke in 1984, together with Peter Hyams, wrote a sequel to his phenomenal and classic 2001, which of course was a movie central to the origin and evolution of humankind, right?
Right.
And in 2001, you have a huge, extraordinary event which takes place. The Star Child comes at the end of a very elaborate plot and transforms human society. That was the uplifting side of 2001 that we all thought we would see when we were growing up and seeing this movie and reading Arthur's novel. Well, what in fact did happen in 2001? A horrible travesty, a consciousness-altering horror which changed everyone's perception previous to 2001 of a positive event into 2001 standing for the world's biggest negative event. You follow where I'm going?
Yes.
Then in 1984, Arthur writes a sequel. The sequel is called 2010, The Year We Make Contact. And in the film, there's a moment when Keir Dullea as Bowman appears again to the head of NASA / whatever NASA was to become in 2010, and he says something wonderful is coming. That is what I think Elenin represents, the something wonderful that Arthur was referring to in the movie 2010. And for those who think we may have missed the date, when did Leonid Elenin discover Elenin?
Right at the end there of 2010.
In 2010.
So, message from Elenin in that sense, and also Richard.
I think Elenin is, if he is not one of the guys, I think he has been selected to be one of the guys. Because remember, all that would have had to have happened for Elenin to be the guy to discover this crucial object is someone sends an email and says, hey, Leonid, look at such and such coordinates on this such and such night.
Could it be a name reference? L9 Nin?
No.
Right.
That's more fear porn.
Okay.
Ellie, Extinction Level Event, was a made-up thing for a movie having nothing to do with reality.
Yeah, no, but I'm looking at his name is in another way, Richard. L meaning God in the ancient language, and Nen, 9, meaning the 9 gods, the Ennead, the Egyptian.
Well, then you have to go back and you have to probe deeply into Leonid Elenin, all the way back to his childhood. Who were his parents? When was he born?
Right.
Were his parents part of this priesthood? Because that's what it is. Did they literally craft Leonid Elenin to be the right guy at the right place at the right time, to be the bringer of the dawn? That is not totally impossible. It's just a little improbable.
Right. Gotcha.
If someone else could have arranged this in a simpler fashion, and again, given that this scenario is so off the wall and so outrageous and so huge for most people to even get their minds around, if you're going to scientifically work through this process, someone needs to now do a thorough forensic study of the life and times of Leonid Elenin, because one can imagine that he is part of a lineal family tradition where he is groomed for this role at this time to bring this message to humankind, and he might not even know it.
Yeah.
Because the symbolism operates whether you know it or not.
You could also toss it around and make spell Lenin out of it. Don't know
Now,
what
the
that
last
means.
piece of data here,
Yeah.
in 1971, I believe, or was it 72? I think it was 72. Arthur publishes an amazing novel called Rendezvous with Rama, which is eerily predictive of the coming of Elenin. It is set a couple of hundred years from now, when we have developed spaceflight to where we have nuclear-powered spacecraft, which are hydrogen fusion-powered so they can accelerate at extraordinary velocities, and they can rendezvous with an object coming out of the dark on a trajectory almost like Elenin, visiting the sun one time on a hyperbolic trajectory and going off into space again. And the society of that era in Arthur's novel is able to rendezvous with the spacecraft, which they call Rama, for reasons you have to read the novel to find out, which are connected, by the way, to ancient Vedic traditions, which are a window into our real ancient history here on planet Earth. And enough said, I'm hoping conscious, intelligent beings will run to their libraries, run to their Googles, and start looking at this stuff. Anyway, in the novel, Arthur has his protagonist rendezvous successfully, land on Rama/Elenin, go inside and discover what it is that this extraterrestrial civilization is trying to tell humankind at a crucial moment in our future history. That is why I believe Elenin arrives at 9/11 in the far eastern time zones, because the answer lies in the Far East. The answer lies in the pyramids in China, in the ancient preserved legacy of our own culture and civilization from 13,000 years ago, the best preserved of which lies not in the Western world, in the developed West, but in the undeveloped so-called Far East, where bits and pieces, both in folklore, in mythology, and in physical structures, remain on this planet to maybe give us clues for how to avert the downside of what someone has forecast could be coming again. And Elenin is the messenger to give us the proper clues. Now, if this model is correct, there's several things we should be doing. One is amateur ham radio operators or amateur radio astronomers all over the planet should be focusing their antennas on Elenin. You can get the coordinates by looking to any website. It's all over Google. It's not a secret. You can find Elenin. It could be broadcasting a radio signal, which could be picked up and translated to give us what we need. Secondly, it may be transmitting laser information, laser pulses, optical laser transmissions as it gets closer to Earth, because those could be picked up by anyone. If the laser was powerful enough, they could be seen with the naked eye. This, in fact, could be the great blue star of the Hopi mythology, which is connected to the Maya, who are connected to the calendar, who are connected to India, who are connected to Rama, who are connected to the dawn. You see how this tapestry all fits together?
Yeah.
If you open your mind and you look at the dots? And it always goes back to the idea There is a hyperdimensional, unmistakable code imbued in the very trajectory of Elenin to get scientists and those who can do mathematics to realize this is not an ordinary object, this is something special, something wondrous, something, as Arthur said, wonderful that is coming.
Clark invented the space study program which detects Rama. This is, from the book Project Space Guard, and on, of course, September 11th, 2077.
Isn't that interesting?
Is when this asteroid struck Italy in the novel. How about that? Yeah.
Well, remember, if I'm right, Arthur was part of the in crowd. He's a member of the followers of Horus. That's why Leonid Elenin is the guy to, quote, discover this. This is huge. This is nothing less than a tipping of the scale for the future of all mankind, which, of course, is why there's all kinds of extraordinary fear porn out there to get everybody to be terrified of Elenin. And I believe, as you laid out very elegantly yourself, Heinrich, why Oslo now fits into the pattern and why this latest terrorist act is, in fact, designed to make us terribly fearful of the bringers of this message, the Masons, the real Masons, who are at the core of this ancient, long-preserved tradition.
Now, can we briefly just talk about here how the ancient people, those who had still a connection, if you will, then, Richard, to the Septepi, the first time that you mentioned, how they managed to technologically create this time capsule, sending it out?
Oh, they're not the ones who did it. No. If this was done, it was done before the catastrophe hit the previous civilization, before the Atlanteans lost their power. It was done by us 13,000 years ago, just slightly more evolved technologically than we are now, except is that true? If you look at the whole tapestry of what's going on, if you project forward from, let's say, World War II to now, we actually tonight, the modern open space agencies, NASA, ESA, the Russians, the Indians, the Chinese, the Japanese, any nation that has a space program should have in its toolkit actual anti-gravity spacecraft capable of flitting out in an afternoon and matching velocities with Elenin, knocking on the front door, going inside and retrieving the critical information required now to save our civilization if the model is correct. Why are we limited to shuttles and rockets and Newtonian physics and things that go boom in the night and reaction and reaction, primitive space hardware? It's because the real stuff, the really important technology, has all gone black in the last 60 years. It's gone underground. It has been captured by the bad guys, by black ops, by the founders of the breakaway civilization, the neo-Nazis, who had their genesis in World War II in the incredible HD torsion field experiments, which Joseph Farrell, Dr. Farrell, alumnus of Oxford University, and his whole series of works. Joseph writes a book a week, I guess. I mean, I've never seen a guy so prolific and so in-depth, able to put together such important information. So for those who are listening who want to understand the technical reason why we can't, in the open, go out and rendezvous Elenin, why the bad guys have got this technology, you need to read the collected works of Joseph Farrell and put those dots all together, which I will do if you don't have time to do all that. In a few days at Leeds at the Exopolitics Conference, where we're going to weave with images all of this tale into a coherent tapestry to lay out the model for what is coming in a few months.
Absolutely. Exopolitics dash or hyphen, whatever you prefer, leeds.co.uk. That's the website for this, the third annual Leeds Exopolitics Conference, and there's quite a bit of names lined up there, obviously, and that's going to be great. So you're heading back to Europe here. Richard
Dolan, who, of course, is a major researcher in this whole secret space program matrix, is going to be there. Stephen Bassett, who's been telling me for years and years and years, disclosure's coming, disclosure's coming. Well, Stephen, finally, like a clock that rings right twice a day, even if it's stopped, Stephen's going to be right. Because to me, the trend curve says disclosure is coming. Disclosure is going to be in the hands of the original Masonic tradition. which is now desperately being discredited by what occurred in Norway, the horror of killing all those people on that date as the sun enters Leo/Horus, etc. The final thing that we haven't discussed, Heinrich, is the Dawn mission, the mission to Vesta.
Yeah.
Because in our analysis, and I'm going to be presenting the data and the images in Leeds, Vesta now has overwhelmingly positive evidence of ancient artificial structures on it, and the most important thing, NASA is not obscuring or blurring the pictures. The data is there, and it will get better and better and better as Elenin gets closer, and I think that is going to be the trigger event, as I will lay out at Leeds, which is going to usher in this whole paradigm of disclosure of our real history and what we must do collectively to use this knowledge Elenin is bringing us in one form or another to change future history. And again, someone is trying to destroy that message.
Before we wrap things up here then for this time, Richard, I want to ask you one more thing about, because you alluded to basically the data, the information that we might be able to get out of Elenin, if you will. That this is something that potentially then will be able to be accessed by every man, if I put it that way, as opposed to a more of an elite faction that has the money and the means to go up there physically and look at it. Or is it more to it than that? Do you actually think that it is more in connection with Rama, that this object actually is more than just an object?
Well, NASA used to have a very, very important kind of motto back in the heyday when I was working with them and when I was covering them for Cronkite and they were going to the moon. It was called no single point failure. In the model that we, our ancestors, our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers have sent this messenger to us, would you rest everything on the speculation or extrapolation that civilization would create the proper means to actually rendezvous with this object? Or would you design it so it could broadcast in as many different channels as possible to as many ordinary people as possible its important message at the right time?
Yes, otherwise it wouldn't be very intelligent or multi-contextual, if you will, yeah.
This, I believe, is where the whole Hopi tradition of the blue Kachina star comes in. If I'm right, Elenin will be transformed from an object which you can't even see with the naked eye into perhaps the brightest, most visible, most amazing celestial phenomenon that we've ever seen.
Really?
Which is trivial. Well, all you have to do is aim a laser at the Earth from it, right? And if the laser is powered by means of a hyperdimensional power source, which is the purview of the technology these guys had, again, if our model is correct, creating a laser that will literally bathe the disk of the Earth 22 million miles away so that anybody on the side facing Elenin sees the same object, and then all you have to do is blink the laser in code, right? And the code will be a simple alphabetic code equating numbers and physics and language. And it will probably be in an ancient language. It may even be in Sanskrit, for all we know, given that is the oldest language derived from the Vedic tradition going back to Arthur and Rama. If that's true, then anyone will be able to go outside with a pad of paper and scribble down dot, dash, dash, dot, 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 dash, dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dot. And it could even be a hyperdimensional tetrahedral code, because that's the code of the universe, which is coded into its very orbit. So this is an amazing model to be tested. And again, I wouldn't be saying a word about this unless there was this overwhelming anti-Elenin propaganda campaign going on actively in all net media right now, obviously being designed to poison the well when this is announced in some form on CNN, on Fox, on MSNBC, CBS, the BBC, Telefunken, etc., etc., etc.
All right, very interesting, Richard. We'll see, obviously, here what Elenin brings that's coming up here. But as we've been talking about here so far, it's certainly not doom, and it should spawn nobody to I don't know, go in the footsteps of someone like Marshall Applewhite and his insane Heaven's Gate cult, right?
See, I believe now that Heaven's Gate. Remember who Applewhite was?
No.
He was CIA.
Well, okay. Well, of course he was dragging down people with him. Yeah, sure.
How best to poison the well decades ago with the fake Hale-Bopp scenario.
Yeah, I know.
And how many of his followers died? How many did he kill?
Was it 11 or something like that?
No.
No.
It was 39.
39?
Twice 19.5.
Okay.
Applewhite was the first fear porn on what is coming.
Yeah, I just remember their Nike shoes. Just do it. It was a big ad campaign.
October 16th. Now, there's nothing that one can see in the record that would make October 16th stand out. However, on October 16th at 19 hours 50 minutes, give or take half a minute, the comet is close to the Earth, Greenwich Mean Time. And 19 hours 50 minutes, of course, is 19.5. Now, how do you get a little tiny object which is absolutely insignificant? It doesn't mean anything in the cosmic order of things. How do you get it timed so it literally is closest to the planet at 19.5 Greenwich Mean Time, which is the world standard of time? Then you have to look at the orbital inclination. The inclination of the orbit, meaning the tilt of the plane of the orbit, because all orbits are planes. They have to go around the sun, where basically they have to go around the sun with the axis of the orbit through the center of the sun, which is the dominant gravitational field that causes them to orbit the sun. The inclination of that orbit is marked off in degrees. Like for Pluto, which is the outermost planet, used to be a planet, now it's technically called a dwarf planet. It orbits at an inclination to the Earth's orbit of something like 17.5 degrees. The orbit of Elenin around the Sun to the Earth's orbit is 1.8439, and you keep following the decimal points out. You divide that number into 360, which is the number of degrees in a total full circle, you get 19.5. 195.
Mm-hmm.
So there are redundancies. There are hyperdimensional tetrahedral redundancies, and I haven't even gone into the other elements on the website where these numbers repeat and repeat. Well, you understand this goes back now to December of 2010, and a gentleman from Russia named Leonid Elenin, who was a mathematician working at the Institute in Moscow. I forget the exact name, but everyone can Google. Google is your friend. Apparently, this guy has been an amateur astronomer for many, many years, and 2 or 3 years, I guess. And you now have the capability, if you have resources, meaning money, you can hire a telescope for a night. You can actually rent time on significant facilities all over the world, and via the internet, you can remote control a telescope with a computer. You can direct it to certain parts of the sky. You can take images. You can then download them. You can, process them on your own computer with not having to be there. You can be literally thousands of miles away, and the staff at the facility will make sure the telescope doesn't break down, and the computer, connections are valid, and the internet service stays up. But you can do remote controlled observations anywhere in the world now, and that's what Leonid Elenin did on the evening of December 10th when he took 4 CCD images, digital images, of a section of the sky in Leo, which is our first curious little coincidence, and he discovered this tiny little fuzzy dot, so dim it was millions of times dimmer than you could see with the naked eye, and he called it Comet Elenin. Well, the first thing that got my attention, other than the fact that his first name is Leo, and that this is photographed in the constellation of Leo, which right there is an important symbolism, is that the magnitude, meaning the brightness, according to the international standards, of the comet when he first detected it and published the news on December 10th of 2009, to the Earth on September 11th, Greenwich Mean Time. It's closest to the Earth when it's September 11th in the far east. And the question then is, why is that relevant? Because when our classic, what we now know as September 11th occurred, the destruction of the two World Trade Center towers and the attack on the Pentagon on September 11th of 2009, the year 2000, it was an event which overtook the entire world. It was 2001. It did not leave unaffected anybody on this planet. We have undergone a social revolution worldwide because of the events that were sparked by 9/11 in New York. Would you agree with that?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Which means if there's any part of the Earth which is involved in this comet, i.e., in terms of its closest approach, then in fact the symbolism is signifying that epic day where the world changed. You can't go through any airport on this planet now without experiencing the effects of 9/11 in the United States. You can't board a train or get on a ship or even go into a major public government building without experiencing the effects psychologically, politically, or emotionally of what happened on 9/11 in the United States. So for the skeptics, the critics, the naysayers, to say, oh, no, this is really going by the Earth on the 10th, no, they're missing the point. This is a global phenomenon, and it is passing the sun at the closest point where one part of the planet is literally on 9/11. The next data point, which made me think this was really unusual, is its closest approach to the Earth, which is on Comet Elenin himself. It's a kind of a big deal because the way the convention goes, if you discover a comet, you get to name it after you. So there's ego involved. But to anybody else, I mean, something that when you discover it somewhere between Jupiter and Mars, which is as far out as it was when he picked it up, and the fact that it's only 19.5 magnitude, they're now forecasting, based on models of conventional comets, that this object won't even reach naked eye brightness as it goes around the sun, as it comes closest to the sun, which is in September, and I'll get to that in a minute. Under any normal circumstance, Heinrich, this would be totally inconsequential. No one should be paying attention. There are something like 100 of these objects that come through the inner solar system every year. So we're dealing down at the 1% level. What makes Elenin so extraordinarily weird and interesting, and the object of so much directed and generated and deliberate fear? This is where I really got curious, so I started looking on the NASA websites. There's one at JPL, and there's others around the world, at what they call the orbital elements, the ephemeris, which is the basic orbit determination based on observations of where this thing is going to be in space at any individual minute. They now know the orbit down to about half a minute, plus or minus. And one of the first things I discovered is that it will be closest to the Earth on September 11th. Now, there are debunkers out there, skeptics, paid trolls, who are spreading lies that this thing has nothing to do with September 11th. That's because they don't want people to know or notice that this thing is closest to the Earth on September 11th. Now, what do I mean by that? It's not closest on September 11th on the east coast of the United States. Its not closest was 19.5. That, of course, for the audience who's been following our work, is a very significant number. Now, the other thing that you need to think about is that December 10th turns out to have been the 2-year anniversary to the night of the Norway spiral appearing over northern Norway and Finland and Sweden, just before our President Barack Obama, arrived in Oslo to pick up his Nobel Prize for Peace. That's where one begins to track the dots as a much larger matrix of something important going on.
Absolutely, and of course we have to talk a little bit about 9/11 as well here, Richard. I don't know if it's the 10th. I've heard different dates on this. The 10th of September or possibly the 11th of September that Elenin is going to be closest to the sun. I believe significance
Okay,
of that.
Well, after I started looking at the fact that this was very strange. I mean, right after Elenin posted these images, there began this very bizarre drumbeat all over the internet, what I call fear porn. There must be 1,000 YouTube videos now claiming that Elenin is going to inaugurate or create the end of the world, that it's really Nibiru,
Right.
that it's a brown dwarf, it's going to destroy the solar system, it's going to smash into the Earth, it has a huge tail of rocks and other debris that pulling in its wake, and we cross the trajectory after it passes the sun, and we're going to be destroyed that way. There is every conceivable nonsense out there, all focused on this absolutely insignificant little speck in the dark that under any normal circumstances no one would even notice.